Hello, welcome to Behind the Wall, your weekly look at China and its complex relationships with Australia and the rest of the world. I'm Stan Grant. The coming century is sure to be punctuated by concerns about our changing climate. Science has shown again and again that unless humanity does more to curb our carbon emissions, we could be living in a very different world in the coming years. Countries across the globe are approaching the challenge in unique ways, including our biggest trading partner, China, which a few weeks ago made a significant announcement. Addressing the UN General Assembly in New York via video link, President Xi Jinping outlined his plans to make China carbon neutral by 2060. And only a few days ago, there were reports energy providers in the nation would halt imports of Australian coal. But is it possible for China, currently responsible for 28% of global emissions, to achieve such a goal? The world's Sean Monteso tried to find out.
It's a commitment that could change the world.
二氧化碳排放力争于2030年前达到峰值，努力争取2060年前实现碳中和。
The goal is ambitious, but is it realistic?
The question is, when the rubber hits the road, what are they really going to do? When you're looking out to 2060, that's a long way away.
I believe the Chinese are serious about this, not because of any love in their hearts for the rest of us necessarily, but because they've got the science themselves.
Beijing has made great strides in recent years, but at the moment, China still seems a long way off achieving its goal. It's the world's biggest carbon emitter, and even though it produces more renewable energy than any other country, China's emissions are not going down.
China is really doing more good green things, but they're not yet doing less bad brown things.
Coal has been at the heart of China's rise as an industrial powerhouse. From 1990 to 2015, annual consumption went from 1 billion tonnes to nearly 4 billion, helping to fuel one of the biggest economic booms in history. Even today, China uses more coal than any other country on the planet. While across the rest of the world, coal use is declining, it is still increasing in China. In addition to roughly 1,000 gigawatts of existing coal capacity, China has 121 gigawatts of coal plants under construction, which is more than is being built in the rest of the world combined.
Chinese coal-fired power plants are on average running at less than half capacity. That's why the fact that more coal plants are being built, and in fact new coal projects accelerated this year, has nothing to do with the need for electricity. It has everything to do to create GDP and jobs through these kinds of projects.
But China's government has hinted that may be about to change.
I think the internal debate on the slow transition out of coal and into renewables in China has been had and it's been resolved, and hence the mid-century target.
But even if China works toward winding down its own love affair with coal, it's involved in hundreds of coal projects overseas, more than half the coal projects currently in development worldwide. President Xi Jinping has touted his Belt and Road Initiative, a massive global infrastructure investment push in nearly 70 countries, as green, healthy, intelligent and peaceful.
Despite all of the guidelines that they've produced, but then what's actually happening on the ground, there's a huge disconnect.
Over the last 20 years, China has invested $350 billion in energy projects overseas, overwhelmingly in fossil fuel industries. $70 billion was for coal projects, nearly all in developing countries. 21 projects were in Indonesia, 12 in Vietnam, and 6 each in India and Pakistan.
Without appropriate controls, you're going to get all sorts of different players pressuring projects which really are not in the good interest of China, not in the interest of the world, and certainly not in the interest of many of the communities that these projects are built.
Eyes are now turning to China's next 5-year plan, due to be delivered by 2021.
These central planning documents in China are taken seriously. And if China represents 30% of global emissions prospectively, then unless China acts itself, it's condemning its own future to extreme weather events, drought, flood and the rest, which they wish to avoid.
Some hope then China could be turning a corner.
For those who are in climate change despair at the moment, this Chinese statement, if it's taken into full effect in the 14th five-year plan, is a positive marker for the future.
Professor Frank Jotzo is the director of the Centre for Climate Economics and Policy at the Australian National University, and he joins me from Canberra. Frank, it's good to have you with us. China is really a paradox, isn't it? On the one hand, it's the biggest global emitter by some way, but it's also the biggest supplier for the global transition to renewable energy. How do you see China's energy future?
Well, precisely. So China has also been the fastest growing energy user and emitter for quite some years. And it has the greatest opportunity to make that energy transition. And that's very likely, well, that's almost inevitably what we're going to see. China will shift to a low carbon energy system over time. And China will do that very largely out of self-interest, and in the event will also lead much of the world getting there. So that recent announcement was really quite an important announcement, because that acknowledgement is certainly there from China that this is and will be China's role.
Yeah, there is that acknowledgement, and there is that goal now of the net zero emissions by 2060. But if we look at the reality here, Frank, is that coal, fossil fuel energy, is going to be part of China's mix for some time. It is still relying heavily on it. It's still opening more coal-fired power stations.
Yeah, that's right. So 40 years is, of course, a very long time indeed. And, you know, I mean, most of the existing stock in terms of industrial installations, power plants and so on and so forth will actually not be directly affected by this announcement, because it's 40 years in the future and most of these plants will in fact be retired anyway by then. What it mostly does is set a signal for the future. And so the kinds of investments that we're seeing going in this year in China, new coal-fired power stations, that's the kind of investments that will likely be affected by this. You know, if China manages to do net zero by 2060 or before, then the kinds of things that are being built now, coal-using infrastructure built now, is likely to become a stranded asset, meaning it won't be run to the end of its economic lifetime. And so that's really where it comes to the crunch. And really, you know, what Chinese government are doing here is sending a signal to the world, but also sending a signal to their own industry, their own state-owned enterprises, about where the journey is going and the need to reconsider those investment priorities in the decade to come, and perhaps especially the next 5-year plan.
What happens in China is one thing, but that's only part of the equation, isn't it? I mean, China is also investing heavily in other countries that are also big emitters, and investing in the development or the opening up of new coal-fired power stations elsewhere. So it's not just what happens in China, but what about China's investment in other parts of the world?
Indeed, and this is really one of the many unresolved questions here. What about the Belt and Road countries, right? So will they be following China's lead in this? Will China invest in the same sort of low carbon, green, high value industry way that it's clearly planning for itself in the mainland? Or will they become the dumping ground for obsolete, brown, high polluting technology? We certainly don't have any clear indications about how that might pan out.
But isn't that a part of China's responsibility? I mean, if it's through its Belt and Road Initiative, it's going to be investing in other countries, China has a responsibility, doesn't it, to invest in countries that are going to pursue cleaner energy?
So responsibility stand is a really interesting concept in this regard. By making this statement at the UN, Chinese president certainly has his country stepping up to the plate and taking that global responsibility on climate change. So, you know, by making that statement, China really positions into a global leadership position on the climate change issue, together with Europe, together with the European Union, Germany, the UK, who have made similar statements about net zero emissions by the middle of the century. And China is clearly out ahead of the rest of the industrializing and developing world by making that kind of statement. And that obviously will also put pressure on China in terms of the scrutiny that will be applied to its external investments, including infrastructure investments. And that's precisely how it should be. And it's this kind of announcement that, I mean, let's face it, that first of all and foremost has a symbolic power. When the year 2060 comes around, I don't think many people will be asking what was the precise commitment made by a President Xi back in the year 2020, right? So what we're
Unless
talking
he's
about
still
here,
president at the time. It is 40 years away, but he is president for life, as we know.
could be a long life indeed, right? But right here, right now, this is mostly a directional statement, and that of course raises all these really big picture issues, including about investment in other countries.
How much of this as well is an indication of the transition in China? It's going through an economic transition. It's relying less on heavy industry and more building up its domestic consumption as a proportion of GDP. But is this part of the natural evolution of the Chinese economy, its economic mix?
Yeah, so declining emissions in China are absolutely part of a natural progression to higher value-added industry, to cleaner production processes, to cleaner energy sources, and that's what the Chinese population, in particular in the cities, also demands, right? So air pollution has got to a level where it is a real nuisance and where it has become a political priority. And the statement that we've seen, including a statement to peak greenhouse gas emissions before the year 2030, which is a strengthening of China's Paris commitment, those statements can be read as an expression of confidence that this is the right way for China, that this is a way that will actually support and bolster China's economic modernization and progress over decades to come. China, it really is the leader in global manufacturing, solar panels, wind turbines, and it certainly is aspiring to a leadership role in electric vehicles, in clean grid technologies, in high voltage transmission technologies, in household batteries. All of these things, China could take a pole position. And I guess, when China makes strong statements, you can see that economic self-interest shining through as well.
You've touched on something there that I think is another thing we need to explore here, and that is as China comes to dominate the supply chain, just as it became the world's factory during the early stages of its economic revolution, it also leads to more political power, doesn't it? Is this part of Xi Jinping's goal here to return China to the apex of global power? As we see the transition of the power of the petro-states to the electro-states, China emerges at the forefront of that, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, you would expect, it's part and parcel of China's place, China's plan to take a much stronger place in the world is economic power. And that economic power is, of course, much more readily achieved through technology leadership, by being not just a manufacturer, but also a developer of future technologies. And, no doubt the Chinese leadership is looking at the internet boom, the IT revolution, and the way that the United States in particular have benefited from that up to now, and is looking for things in which it can take a similarly dominant position in global markets, and clean energy would lend itself for that.
Is this not a concern? Because, of course, we've seen this schism now in geopolitics. On the one side, you have the United States and allies, and Australia is really at the crosshairs of this. And then you have China. China seen to be more assertive, even aggressive under Xi Jinping, an authoritarian country that has become increasingly authoritarian under Xi Jinping. Does this not raise some political calculations here, some potentially difficult things to navigate? As China dominates this new world of energy, it brings with it its political clout. Where does that leave the great power competition politically?
You're right, that concern will certainly be there, and the most likely outcome is that we will see a competition for leadership in these industries, and in fact that competition is already playing out. Just look, for example, at the emerging large-scale production of electric cars, right? And so you've got right now the US really as a powerhouse in this, but Europe, Germany included, is catching up rapidly. Korea, Japan positioning working on this as well together with, well, in parallel to China. And so this is most likely to play out as a large power competition, right? Who has the nose in front in terms of energy.
Just finally on that then, how far advanced is China? You ran through the areas where China already has dominance, if not very quickly approaching almost a monopoly when it comes to the production of these different forms of energy. Batteries you've talked about as one example. How far advanced is China vis-a-vis countries like the United States or even Australia, who may have missed the starter's gun to some extent?
Yeah, not a monopoly supplier, but certainly the largest low-cost supplier, and that's been traditionally China's advantage, including in batteries, for example, for domestically used electric vehicles in China. The struggle for China will be to achieve genuine technology leadership. So in most of these technologies, the US, European producers and other East Asian producers still are in front, and that's where you can really expect China to put emphasis attaining that technological edge, which then also brings the greatest economic payoffs.
Professor Jotzo, good to have you on the program. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you, Stan.